Recording in progress.
Today's daf we're going to learn is Sukkah daf Zayin. Today's daf is dedicated anonymously for the yurtzeit of the Ari HaKadosh. Okay, we're starting from the very bottom of Daf Vav Amud Bet. We were talking about the opinion of the rabbis that one needs for a minimum shiur of a sukkah is two sides with one extra side that can be kind of less than a regular wall. And we're going to learn today about exactly what are the requirements. So we're going to start from the bottom of the daf, 3 lines from the bottom. Oto tefach hechan ma'amido. This tefach, where does it go? The third wall just has to be a tefach wide. Where exactly does that tefach go? Amarav ma'amido keneged hayotze. So Rav says, and I'm going to pull up pictures from the study guide. So we're going to go, actually, I'm going to stop for a minute. I'm going to do it. Share screen. We're going to do it in this way. Okay. We're going to go now to the top of the page, and we're going to talk about different ways that you can do this while being a tefach. So the first picture we have is two sides, 7 tvachim minimum. That's what we talked about, Beit Shammai's opinion, which is the opinion we hold by. 7 by 7 tvachim are each of the walls, which is not very long. And I even put on the sheet here that a tefach is 8 centimeters or 9.6 centimeters, depending on your opinion. So, right, so there's different opinions about the sizes. So assume, right, 7 tefachim, 56 centimeters minimum, okay, each side. And then you have one tefach on the side here, 8 centimeters. That's your extra wall. So one of those, mavido keneged hayotze, means this extra tefach wall has to come out of one of the existing walls. We're assuming right now that the two walls are perpendicular to each other. They meet at a right angle. And then we have to add on a tefach of a wall, also at a right angle to one of those walls. Amar le Rav Kahana v'Rav Asi l'Rav, v'yamidenu keneged rosh tov. Why don't you do it, move down to the next picture, why don't you do it like on an angle, the third wall? Instead of having it at a right angle, why don't we have it angled? Now we're going to have two different opinions. We have the we have Rashi's interpretation, the way the Maharsha understands, which is, okay, and this is according to the picture that you see printed in your Gemara, which is, right, depending on what Gemara you have, there's different, right, but you can see in Rashi, there's these pictures where it comes off the same way Rav thought, but instead of coming down to the right angle, it comes off one of the walls angled in, okay, on a diagonal. According to Rabbeinu Hananel and Rashi, according to the Ritva's interpretation, it's opposite the 90-degree angle, the angle where the two meet, and the opposite corner, right? Almost like that way it kind of covers the third and the fourth side because it's angled facing that right angle in the corner. Okay, so if you look at the diagrams on the study guide, it'll definitely help you if you're not watching the video right now. So they asked Rav this question, and the response they received was, Shatikra. Rav was silent. He didn't answer. He just was silent. What does that mean? How do we interpret this silence? So it happens often that rabbis are silent in the Gemara. Sometimes we say shtika koda'ah, which means that he admits, oh, they must be right. But other people say, no. Silence doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. Silence means that he thought it was a ridiculous question and he just ignored them. Okay, and that's another possible way to understand it. And we're going to see further, and this further proves the point that unlikely that he accepted their opinion, because we're going to see that Amar Shmuel Mishmei the Levi, Shmuel said in the name of Levi, Ma'amido keneged hayotze, just like Rab said, V'chein morim be'midrasha, also in the Beit Midrash they taught this, Ma'amido keneged hayotze. Okay, so that's our first opinion. The Rav says, put up this wall that's a tefach. And then there was this debate because the others thought that it should be angled and not at a right angle. Now we're going to move on to the next opinion. We're at Rabbi Simon in the name of Rabbi, or some people say it was Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. So look at the next picture. Rabbi Simon, v'itema, that means, and some people say, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, amav, oselo tefach soche, umamido b'pachomish shloshat tefachim samuch l'dofen. Make a tefach that's a little bit more than a tefach, a wider than usual tefach, meaning a little bit more than a tefach wide. And then what do? Mamido b'pachomish shloshat tefachim. Leave it, put it up, position it, not up against where one of the walls end, but move away from there where the wall ends, a little bit less than 3 tvachim. Why? Less than 3 tvachim, this is what we call levud. This means, if anything, if there's a space of less than 3 tvachim, and then there's wall and wall on the other side, we view it as if it's one continuum. We learned this many times in Eruvin, we learned it in Shabbat. It's as if it's one. So therefore, if something, right, we've seen it where something's off the floor by less than 3, we view it as if it's on the floor. So here, if your wall is less than 3 tvachim away from the other wall, and it's a little more than a tefach wide, then you end up counting the less than 3, plus the 1, plus it's a little bit more than 1. And all together, you end up with a 4 tvachim wall. So Rabbi Simon and Rabbi Shua ben Levi say, you should do it like that. And then let's keep reading. Anything that's less than 3 away from the wall is considered levud. It's as if it's against the wall, and then you have a 4 tvachim wall, which would be way better than a 1 tefach. What he's basically saying is, with minimum effort, all you have to do is make sure it's a little bit more than a tefach. Move it away from the wall, a little less than 3 tvachim. And already, instead of taking that 1 tefach and putting it up against the wall and having only a 1 tefach wall, you can end up with a 4 tvachim wall. And that's much better than a 1 tefach wall. So basically, that's what they suggest. So we have 2 opinions, basically, or 3 opinions, really. We have Rav who says a 1 tefach wall, right, coming off of that original wall, right? One of the walls that exist already. Then coming off at a right angle. Then we had Rav Kahana and Rav Asi who said, why don't you have it come at an angle? And then it kind of closes it, right? The beauty of the angle is it feels more like it's closing it, depending on which opinion you go by, especially if you say the one where it's opposite, then it almost feels like there's 4 walls. And then we have Rabbi Simon and Rabbi Shua ben Levi, or Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that they think you just need a more significant wall, but you don't actually have to have it more significant in size. You just move it away and it already creates this fictitious wall that's like a 4 tvachim wall. If you remember in Masechet Eruvin and Shabbat, we kept seeing these numbers. There's 4 cubits, which that was Rebbe's opinion about the minimum sukkah. There's 4 tvachim, right? We saw that in a mavoi, and different things about a mavoi. There were things that were 4 tvachim. There were things, right, which is 4 handbreadths as opposed to 4 cubits. Remember, cubits, 6 cubits to, 6 handbreadths to a cubit. So 4 amod and 4 tvachim are very different. And then we have this 1 tefach, which other things we saw in the Masechet Eruvin, for example, were also 1 tefach was significant. So these are all significant measurements. So Rabbi Simon or Rabbi Shua ben Levi much prefer to use a bigger measurement for this extra wall than just the small tefach. But again, using fictitious rules about this levud, or imaginary wall, where it's as if there's a wall, then that's even better. So that's their opinion. Now we're going to do another case. Amar Rav Yehuda, Sukkah asuya kemavoi. This was all until now. We were talking about 2 walls that are perpendicular. Now we're going to talk about 2 walls that are parallel to each other. What do you do? So Rav Yehuda says, Sukkah asuya kemavoi. He says, Kshera. Okay, this is fine, as long as oto tefach mamido lechol ruach shiur. You add 1 tefach. Again, we have 2 parallel walls attached to any one of them in any place. It's fine. So 1 tefach wall. And that's already considered 3 walls. But we're going to have again Rabbi Simon, the Itema, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Omer, Osim lo pas arba'a v'mashu. Already he jumps a lot. A tefach is not sufficient here. Why is it not sufficient? Because we don't really have 2 kosher walls. The walls aren't attached to each other. So because of that, the Gemara is going to actually ask why you need this. So I'll hold off on that. But what do you do according to them? Take a 4 tvachim with a little bit more. Okay, that's arba'a v'mashu, 4 handbreadths and a little bit of a wall. Ma'amido b'pechomish l'sha samuch l'dofen. Put it less than 3 away from one of the walls. V'chol pechomish l'sha samuch l'dofen k'levud dami, and then it's going to be as if it's attached to the wall. And then we end up with another 7 tvachim wall. So we basically have 7 tvachim wall, 7 tvachim wall, and 7 tvachim wall. 3 walls that are 7 tvachim. He much prefers we do that. So the Gemara says, why in the first case did he only need a tefach, and here all of a sudden he needs 4? Don't understand. So they say, and this is what I mentioned before, there we had 2 kosher walls that were attached to each other. Therefore, it was okay to add this 1 tefach. But here you don't have 2 kosher walls because they're not next to each other. So therefore, you'd need it to be at least a 4 tvachim plus wall in order to use the rules of Lavud. Have it as if it's attached to the wall. Again, it would have to be less than 3 away from the wall. Your 4 plus, altogether that equals 7. And then you have a fully functioning wall, even though you don't really. Amar Rava, ve'ena, now we're going to have 3 versions of what Rava says about this. Okay, we're going to see 3 versions of Rava. We're going to see some pictures of this as well. So Rava now says, according to the first version, ve'ena niteret ela b'tzurat hapetach. By the way, this one tefach we've been discussing is only if you have what we call it tzurat hapetach. You might remember that if you learned Masechet Eruvin. Tzurat hapetach is something on one side, something on the other, and a beam connecting the two. And it looks like an opening, like an entranceway. Without that, you can't just add this wall and think it's a wall. It has to have something above it that's connecting the two sides. So he says, you have to have ein niteret ela b'tzurat hapetach. Okay, now what Rashi explains here is what does he require? So take this tefach that we said. It's not like we thought before. Put a 1 tefach wall up on one side. No, you have to split it into 2. Half a tefach here, half a tefach there, and that goes on either side. And then this beam, cross beam, going from one side to the other. Now, I wrote here in the Hebrew on the study guide, but I'll explain it to you in English, that even though the picture here is the case of 2 opposite walls, apparently Rava is also relevant for if you had 2 walls next to each other. You would still need a tzurat hapetach. Okay, so it wouldn't only be if they're parallel, but even if they're perpendicular to each other. And then you'd need, again, half a tefach, and a tzurat hapetach on top. Some people say, you can do either or. You could do 1 tefach next to it without a tzurat hapetach, or you can have smaller ones on either side with the tzurat hapetach going across. And then it seems that according to this opinion, you wouldn't even need an irregular tzurat hapetach on Shabbat, which is called a lechi and a korah, right? The lechi are the 2 beams on the sides, and the korah is the cross beam. You wouldn't actually need for those beams standing up to be more than a little bit. They don't even have to be half a tefach. They could even be less than half a handbreadth. They just have to be, you have to have both and one going across, or you need 1 tefach on one side without the tzurat hapetach. That's the second version. You also need tzurat hapetach. According to this interpretation, I'll show you the picture. It's a little bit hard to see from the picture, but you need, okay, I tried to color it bolder here. You need a dofen of a tefach. You still need the tefach wall. And you also need, it was harder for me to show this going across, you also need the tzurat hapetach going across. Okay, so you would also get the tzurat hapetach, this thing I drew here is really above. Okay, so you'd have 2 walls perpendicular to each other. Again, I drew this, you could draw it the other way as well. And you would have a tzurat hapetach going over the 1 tefach wall. So you could have a little bit on the other side, but you'd have to have a full tefach on one side for it to work. Okay, so you would need both. That's the most stringent position. Rav Ashi, now we're going to have a story. So he saw Rav Kahana, who did this tefach, this wider tefach, okay, and then and he also did a tzurat hapetach. So he had the tefach. This actually was according to the other opinion of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi or Rabbi Simon, that because it seems like Rava was also talking according to them, where they moved the tefach away from the wall less than 3. It was a little more than the tefach, and that laws of Levud, and he did a tzurat hapetach. So Amar le lo savar lamral had Rava da Amar Rava v'niteret nami b'tzurat hapetach. Don't you agree with the second version of Rava that said it's also okay with the tzurat hapetach, meaning you don't need both? So Amar le ana ki idach lishon de Rava svira le da Amar Rava utzricha nami tzurat hapetach. I hold by Rava, by the third version, who says you need also to have a tzurat hapetach. You actually need both. Okay, and we hold that way, that you need both the tefach wall and the tzurat hapetach. Okay, or alternatively, like Rabbi Simon, but I didn't check which one we hold by. Yeah, it seems like we hold like Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi or Rabbi Simon, who says that you need a pas arba'ah, and it needs to be within 3 from the wall. It's not enough to just have a tefach, and it's not enough even if you have the you've moved it away from the wall with the pas arba'ah. you still would need a Tzurat Petach going above it. Okay, moving on. Or if it was that was the two parallel walls. If it's the two perpendicular, then you just need a tefach and a little bit more moved away from the wall, 3 tvachim, to have a 4 tvachim wall. Okay, and then you would need, in addition, a Tzurat Petach on top. Okay, Shtayim Kil Chatan. Now we're going to go back to this line that you need 2 walls Kil Chatan, okay, 2 halachic walls, and then 1 that's a little smaller. So Ama Rabba, it says Rabba, it really should be Rabba, okay, which was someone from the generation before Rabba. They actually lived at the same time, and sometimes argue with each other, but it seems it's Rabba, according to most of the rabbis most of the commentaries change it. Rabba says, V'chein l'Shabbat. This tefach wall, this little wall, actually functions, or having 1, a tefach and a little more away from the wall, right? 3, less than 3 away from the wall. V'chein l'Shabbat. This is also true for Hilchot Shabbat. What's relevant for Hilchot Shabbat? If you're in the middle of the public domain and you have 2 walls and another smaller wall, can we count this as if this whole area is a private domain and one could carry in it? Or is it still a public domain? So they say, just like it works for Sukkah, it also works for Shabbat. So that means it'll count as a Sukkah, and it'll also mean you could carry inside of it. Abaye questions him and says, do you really say, since this works as a wall for Sukkah, it's also going to work for Shabbat? Don't we know? V'hatanya, it says in the Braita, Dofen Sukkah kedofen Shabbat. The same requirements for Sukkah are the same as the requirements for a wall for Shabbat. As long as you don't have between reeds, we're now talking about if I have a wall made of just reeds that are very thin. As long as I have less than 3 in between reeds, we can view this all as one wall. So far, so good. Sounds like the rules are the same. The Yitera Shabbat al Sukkah, but Shabbat is more stringent than Sukkah. Shabbat Shabbat only works if you have more of the wall standing than you have open. Okay, so if we're going to have this wall that has a 4 tvachim plus wall with a big opening of a less than 3, and let's say there's an opening on the other side, and more of the wall is not standing than the part that's the 4 tvachim that's standing, that's not going to work. So what do you see? For Shabbat, it won't work, but for Sukkah, it will work, because we just said the Sukkah works fine. Masha Einkin, but Sukkah, as the Braita says, that is not the case for Sukkah. So how could you say, Rabba, how could you say, since this works for Sukkah, it works also for Shabbat? For Shabbat, you need this additional criteria. There has to be more of the wall standing than open. So they say, my lab yitera Shabbat de Sukkah asukah, below amrin amigo. So now they say, wait a minute, is it not? And here, this is really the question. Is it not that the Braita is saying Shabbat is more strict than Sukkah, and you don't say migo, meaning, right, that Shabbat of Sukkah is more stringent than Sukkah in general, meaning the day of the week that's Shabbat on Sukkah, you can't actually carry in your Sukkah, because that's what he means when he says Yitera Sukkah, right? What were the words? Yitera Shabbat al Sukkah, Shabbat inani teret ela ba'omei parutz murba ala parutz. So there it said, Shabbat is more strict. That Shabbat, this doesn't work for Shabbat. So there you are in your Sukkah on Shabbat, and you actually can't carry inside, it sounds like. So how could you say, since this works for Sukkah, it works for Shabbat? So they say, no, don't read it that way. Read it like this. Yitera Shabbat de Alma al Shabbat de Sukkah. That week only, we'll say that since this functions as your Sukkah, we're going to view this as a private domain. But any other time of the year, if you have such a situation, we are not going to consider that a private domain. But definitely on the Shabbat of Sukkah, that week, we definitely will consider it a private domain, which comes out to this very interesting thing. That you can have a wall that 1 week will be considered a wall enough for Shabbat to say this is an enclosed area and you can carry, which will be the week of Sukkot, but it won't work on any other week of the year. It's very interesting. The same wall, right, will not be considered anything, because only for Sukkot does it have significance, because this now becomes your halachic Sukkah. So therefore, the migo of Rabbah really does work. So the Gemara asks, though, but then you should read it should be read the following way. That source that the Braita should have read, Yitera Sukkah de Alma, a Sukkah de Shabbat. should have said, right, the sukkah in general is better, is actually more strict than a sukkah on Shabbat. De'ilu sukkah ba'alma baya tefach sochek. De'ilu sukkah de Shabbat lo baya tefach sochek. V'sage belechi. Wait a minute. But if you're already talking about what's more strict than Shabbat of Sukkah to Shabbat during the year, we should all, or actually the opposite, what's more strict of Shabbat during the year to Shabbat of Sukkah? We should also say what's more strict of Sukkah in general compared to Shabbat of Sukkah. Okay, what is that? Because the Sukkah needs a tefach sochek. We said the Sukkah needs a tefach plus, right? Moved away from the wall 3 handbreadths. But a Sukkah on Shabbat doesn't need a tefach sochek v'sagi belechi. The rules of Shabbat are that if you just have a lechi, a beam, that already acts as a mechitza, as a wall to carry inside. So there we should say that the Sukkah, right, on a regular day needs a tefach sochek, but a Sukkah on Shabbat, right, is enough to just have a lechi to allow you to carry inside. So if they were comparing this to that, a Sukkah during the year, Shabbat on Sukkot and Shabbat on a regular week, they should have compared Sukkah on a regular day to Sukkah on Shabbat. So they say, and because aren't you the one, Rabbi, they say, who says this? And then therefore the Braita, according to your reading, should have said this also. Because Atu da'amal sikech al gabe mavoy sheyesh lo lechi kasher. If you took a mavoy, again, we saw that before, 2 walls parallel to each other, and it has a lechi in the front. That's usually what allows you to carry within that alleyway. This reminds us of Masechet Eruvin. And you sikech al gabe mavoy. You put schach on top of those 2 walls, going from one to the other, and so it has 2 walls plus this lechi kasher. You can carry within there. Okay. So they say hahu lo itzrich, right? So now they say, because the lechi works on Shabbat, this sukkah will be a kosher sukkah because the whole, right, the migo will allow this to work. So therefore, if Rava says this, that it's fine. So if Rava says this, and the Mishnah was comparing sukkah on the Shabbat of Sukkah to the Shabbat of all year, it should have compared the Sukkah on a regular day to Sukkah on Shabbat, where all of a sudden on Shabbat, because the lechi has significance for Shabbat, that means you could create a Sukkah in this manner. So it should have said this. So the Gemara says, it didn't need to say this, even though Rava thinks that this is the case. Why not? You wouldn't need to say that, because if it goes in one direction, saying Shabbat is usually more stringent, and yet we're going to allow the Shabbat of Sukkah for this to be considered a Sukkah, then obviously, if this works for Shabbat, then obviously it's going to work for a Sukkah. But Shabbat is always more stringent than Sukkah. So if this works, this lechi works in the mavoy for Shabbat, of course, if you put the schach on top, it's going to work for Sukkah. So therefore, there's no need for even them to tell us this because it would be obvious. That's why the Braita didn't mention it, not because it's not the case. And not because what he tried to compare originally is what, this was all based on the reading that we answered the question against Rabbah of the Braita, was the way we read the Braita would imply that we should say, I have said this also. And then they said, no, you didn't need to have said it because it would have been obvious. Gufa. Now we're going to go more in depth into what Rabbah said. Amar Rabba, additionally, he said, if you put schach on top of pasei biraot, you might remember this if you learned Eruvin. This is, you put 4 diomadim, which are dio from duo, 2. You put on each, okay, let's start with the beginning. You have a well, okay, or a pit full of water. You want people, when they're going on Aliyah L'Regel to go to Jerusalem for the holidays, you want them on the way, when they're on Shabbat and they're resting, you want their animals to be able to drink. So how are their animals going to drink? Well, they need to be able to bring their animals into this area near the well. The problem is the well is in Reshut Rabim, it's in the public domain. So it's an issue, and you don't want them carrying water at all in the public domain. So what do they allow? They allow you to they would put up these posts, little corner pieces, each a tefach wide, that would go in 2 directions at each corner. Okay, imagine 4 of them going in each corner. And they would basically surround this area. It didn't have walls because they wanted to make it as simple as possible. But it's as if there's imaginary walls. Since you put up these 4 in each of the 4 corners, this double thing that each is a tefach wide, we view it as if it's a full wall. And even though normally for Shabbat you need omei meruba ala parutz, more of it standing, this is a particularly unique situation where they allowed it. If you put schach on top of it, okay, even though you really need walls, this actually is a kosher sukkah. So now they say, utsricha, why did Rabbanit need to tell us both those halachas? If you had the mavoi, you would say, well, look, a mavoi has 2 perfect walls. So it's great. You have great 2 walls, and now we're putting schach on top. But there we have no good walls at all. Each one is just a tefach wide. It's nothing. So you might have thought, alone, maybe it won't work if you put schach on top. Let's do the reverse. If you said pasei biraot, you might not have been able to learn mavoi. Why? Mishum de'ika shamar bad fanot, because pasei biraot has a semblance of 4 walls, because in each corner it goes out in 2 directions, and we basically have each side has a small wall on one, a small wall on the other, and you could view them as if they attach. But in a mavoi, you don't have 4 walls. You only have 2. Aim alone, maybe it wouldn't work. Plus that little lechi, you might have thought that little lechi doesn't really count. What if you had those 2? So you have the pasei biraot and you have the sikecha gabe mavoi. So you would have thought hani tarte michamirta lekilta, aval mikirta but mikilta lechamirta aim alo. But you might not have thought that you would have assumed we can go from Shabbat to Sukkah, but you might not have thought we could go from Sukkah to Shabbat, right? And that's to say that the migo, the Rabbah originally said, remember, he said, the chen l'Shabbat, since this works as a dofen for Shabbat, for Sukkah, it would work to say we could carry within this area also on Shabbat. You might not have assumed we'd go in that direction, because that's going from something that's easier, Sukkah, to something that's more stringent, Shabbat. Kamashma, and that's why Rabbi told us all these 3 halachot, because you wouldn't have been able to learn one from the other. Moving back to our original mission. If the sunlight is more than the shade, it's disqualified. Now we're going to have a machloket about this. Tanu Rabbanit. We're talking about sunlight. You can ruin it if more sun comes through the schach than shade. But not from the walls. Let's say your wall is short and it doesn't go up higher and the sun comes right through the wall, the side. That's not going to mess up your sukkah if you end up with more sunlight in the sukkah than shade, because we're talking only about the schach. It has to be, right? Remember that the main part of the sukkah is the schach, not the walls. You need walls, but the main part is the schach. The schach has to be the thing providing shade. If the schach provides shade, but the walls are open and they bring in lots of sun, that doesn't ruin your sukkah. Rabbi Yoshaya Omer, he says, no, even if it's coming through your walls, it's still a problem. The fact is, right now, I would view this in a particular way. We're going to see the Gemara goes in a different direction. But it sounds to me like it's a rule in your sukkah and how much sun is in your sukkah, or is it a rule in the schach? If it doesn't have to do with if the sun comes in, but it's not because of the schach, we don't care. The whole issue is your schach kosher? Your schach is good. Okay, so the sun in the sukkah, that's not the issue. Okay, is schach, in order to be a covering, it has to be something that creates shade. If your covering doesn't create shade, it's a problem. The fact that you open your window or you have walls that are wide open and sun comes through, that's not the problem of your schach. According to Rabbi Yoshaya, no. You end up with something that's an unpleasant place to live in because it's full of sun, and that's not what we want, or whatever reason, it has to be less sun than shade. So maybe, right, less sun and more shade, then, that's why he thinks it's also going to be a problem. But we're going to see, the Gemara says this a little bit differently than I said. Amar Rabbi Yemer bar Shlemi Mishmei Abai. My tamed Rabbi Yoshia. Dechtiv v'sakota al Aaron et parochet. It says in Sefer Shmot at the end of the book, it says you're going to put over the Aaron, you're going to make a sakota, like a sukkah, which is schach, a covering. Over the Aaron, what is it? The parochet. Now, where did the parochet go? Parochet v'chitza. It's a curtain that's separated between the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kodeshim. Right? Let's go back to Yoma. So that's a wall. And yet it called it schach. So what do you see? A wall can be counted as schach. That's why I say it's different. He does seem to think it's a rule in the schach, but that the walls also somehow function like schach. Alma mechitza kischach be'ina. This is at least the way they interpret it. I don't know if that's what Rabbi Yoshai originally meant, but that's what the Gemara is explaining. Therefore, mechitza is like schach. The Rabbanim, what do they do with that pasuk? That pasuk, don't worry about that pasuk. It means when you hang the parochet, it has to be a little bit of it going over the top so that it covers something. But then it's mainly a mechitza and not a schach. Amar Abai, Rabbi Yoshaya, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabban Gamliel, Beit Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer, V'acherim. It's a long list of people. Kulu sfira le sukkah dirat keva be'ina. This is something common that Abai does and some other people as well. Abai happens to be one of the people that likes to do this. Takes a whole bunch of different opinions about different things and say that really all based on one thing. It's a very nice approach to kind of try to combine different things that seem different, and yet they're really getting at the same idea. All these people that we just mentioned all hold that your sukkah has to be a permanent structure, somewhat permanent, right? It has to be like your house, as close to your house as possible, not something temporary, but something much more serious. So how do we see this? We're going to go through one by one. Rebbe Detanya, as we saw, Rebbe Yomi, Kol Sukkah she'en ba'arba amot al arba amot psula. It has to be 4 by 4 cubits, not 6 tfachim or 7 tfachim, which is almost a quarter of that size. But it really needs to be much bigger. Again, 4 by 4 is still pretty small, but it has to be something that could actually function as a house. That's the shiur that we saw is for houses. Rabbi Yoshaya had amaran. That's okay. That's what we just saw. That he says you need no sun to come in, not even from the walls. It's like a house. A house doesn't have sun coming through the walls, right? Coming through it's not open, these open walls where sun gets right through, right? Any kind of too much sun is not going to be a dirat keva because you can't function in a place like that. Rabbi Yehuda Ditznan, Sukashi Gvoha Lamala Me'aslim, Ama Psula, Rabbi Yehuda Machshir. That's our Mishnah. 20 cubits high is still fine because he doesn't mind that it's a very permanent type structure. Whereas the rabbis think it has to be temporary. Nobody has a temporary abode that's so tall. Rabbi Shimon, what's he? Detanya. Shtain kilchatan v'shlosha afilu tefa. Right, this is the Braita that says you need 2 walls and one can be even. The third can be only a tefa. Rabbi Shimon omer shalosh kilchatan ve'arba afilu tefa. You need 3 full walls and the 4th one can be a tefa. He obviously needs a much more serious structure. Rabban Gamliel, what's his opinion? Detanya, sesukato berosh agala. You put it at the top of a chariot, or berosh spina, or a boat, something moving, right? Your wagon or your boat. That's not going to work. Rabban Gamliel posel, he says that's no good because that's not a house. You would never have a movable house that's on a boat. Okay, it happens in the Far East. There are people, and I'm sure in other places as well, but I saw it there, where people actually live on boats. Okay, they do have houses on boats, but it's regularly people do not do this kind of thing. Bit Rabbi Akiva Machshir. He actually thinks it's fine because he doesn't mind that it be temporary, but Rabban Gamliel obviously wants it to be temporary, permanent. Beit Shammai ditnan. What about Beit Shammai? Mishaya rosho v'rubo b'sukkah v'shulchano b'toch habayit. Beit Shammai puslin u'beit Hillel machshirin. So Beit Shammai says you also have to have room for your table inside. Otherwise, it's not really like your house if your table's not in the sukkah. So again, even though this is relative because he doesn't think like Rebbe, who needs 4 cubits by 4 cubits, but still he thinks it needs to be more than Beit Hillel. Ditznan had that we read. Rabbi Eliezer, what about him? Ditznan, ha'osesu kato kimin tzrif, oshes samcha lekota. This is like a teepee. It has a teepee and it's got a point at the top. It's rounded and with a point at the top. Or his sukkah is leaning up against a wall. This is like if somebody lives in a roof, their wall is also their ceiling. Same here. Your wall is your ceiling. That's not really a house. You wouldn't call that a house. You wouldn't build a whole house like that. Maybe you'd live in a room like that. Even that is a little bit uncomfortable, but certainly wouldn't live in a house like that. I mean, again, people would, but most people have permanent homes do not do that. Lefisha ein lagag. Rabbi Eliezer says it's no good because it's missing a roof. The chachamim machshirim, the rabbis actually say this is fine. Achirim, what about achirim? Detanya, often achirim is associated with Rabbi Meir. Achirim omrim, others say, sukkah suya kishovach, if it's made like a dovecote, psula. There's a debate about what exactly this is. Lefisha ein la zaviyot, because it has no angles. Okay, so it seems, is it the fact that it's round? Is it the fact that we're talking about the size of a dovecote, which is very small? Or is it that it's rounded and it doesn't have a real roof at the top? Maybe that's why it's a bit of a debate exactly what this is. But again, it's another case where it seems to have the need for something more permanent. So we saw all these opinions and how they fit in with that. Now we're going to talk about round sukkahs since we just mentioned it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, sukkah suya kikivshan, okay, like a furnace, which is round. Im yesh behekefa kedei leshev ba 24 bnei adam kshera. If the circumference of that is, you could fit 24 people, it's good. Vim lav psula. It's not big enough to fit 24 people around, it's no good. So we're going to have to figure out the mathematics. We're really only going to start a little bit today, and we're going to finish this up tomorrow. Kiman, ki Rebbe d'amar. Wait a minute. Who are you holding like? Rebbe d'amar. Kol sukkah she'en ba'arba amot al arba amot psula. Are you going to say it must be the bigger amount because it sounds like a very big circle if it's going to fit 24 people? So if that's the case, maybe it comes from this 4x4 cubit measurement. It certainly doesn't come from 6 or 7 tefachim. That's much smaller than 24 people. But now we have to fit a circle into a square. We have to do the conversion. So it's complicated. How do you do the conversion? So they're going to say, a person sits, takes a space of about an amma. So if you start doing the math and you say, now this is pi, except pi for them was, instead of 1 to 3.14, it's 1 to 3 to just 3, simply. Okay, they had a simpler understanding of pi, or they didn't in general. We've seen this before. They don't really work in decimals. So they just say a 1 to 3, right? If you have a circumference of 3, you'll have a diameter of a tefach. And then we're going to see how they do the math. I'm going to stop kind of mid-sentence because this continues on to tomorrow's page, which is this attempt to try to figure out the calculation. If that's the case, what would 4x4 amma be? It still wouldn't actually match this amount properly. So we'll get to that tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody.